Hey everyone! Today we're diving into the epic world of the Crusades, where massive armies of Christians and Muslims clashed over control of the Middle East from the 11th to the 15th century. Picture this, over 100,000 men on both sides, with warriors traveling from all across Europe to join the Christian forces and from Western Asia and North Africa to fight for the Muslim side. The Christian armies had a secret weapon, heavily armored knights, super disciplined and tough to beat. But the Muslim forces weren't to be underestimated, with their light cavalry and expert archers making them deadly on the battlefield. As the years went by, both sides actually learned a lot from each other, borrowing weapons and tactics to gain an edge. The Crusades were a huge deal, with both sides pouring tons of resources into them. While the Christian armies found some success in places like Spain and the Baltic, it was the Muslim forces, with their superior strategies and better logistics, that ultimately managed to hold on to the Holy Land, which was really the main prize. Now let's talk about the European armies. These were a wild mix of fighters. You had the famous knights, decked out in full armor, but also light cavalry, bowmen, crossbowmen, and infantry armed with swords, spears, and pretty much any weapon you could think of. Most knights swore loyalty to a specific leader, but since many crusades were led by a bunch of different nobles, kings, or even emperors, you'd have a mix of nationalities and languages all trying to work together, which wasn't always smooth sailing. There was always a lot of tension about strategy with so many powerful leaders involved. Most of the time, these armies were raised through a feudal system, meaning barons would conscript men from their lands. There were also plenty of mercenaries mixed in, especially infantry from places like Brittany and the Low Countries, and let's not forget the highly respected Italian crossbowmen. The kings, if they got involved, could also draft pretty much any able-bodied man, but these guys weren't exactly the most well-trained or well-equipped soldiers. Getting all these armies to where they were needed was a massive task. The Italian cities of Genoa, Pisa, and Venice often provided ships for transport and sometimes even troops and ships for battle. And let's not forget, armies of tens of thousands of men needed a huge support crew. Non-combatants like cooks, laborers, priests, and even squires and servants were all part of the mix. Moving on, we have the Crusader states, 4 key regions in the Middle East: the Principality of Antioch, the County of Edessa, the County of Tripoli, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem. These states had to raise their own armies, often relying on a mix of feudal tenants, free men, and mercenaries. The local population couldn't be conscripted since they were mostly Muslim and lacked training. With so few Westerners, the Crusader states were always short on soldiers and had to rely heavily on the military orders like the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller. These military orders were like the elite forces of the Crusades. Originally formed to protect pilgrims, they soon became a powerful military presence, with knights who were some of the best trained and best equipped in the region. They took on some of the most dangerous tasks, garrisoning key castles and providing hundreds of knights for battle. These guys were so skilled and feared that if they were ever captured, they were usually executed on the spot. Their enemies didn't want to face them on the battlefield again. However, these military orders were fiercely independent, which sometimes led to clashes with the rulers of the Crusader states. They were also known to get a bit carried away in battle, sometimes charging ahead without support, but their bravery and importance to the crusading cause were never in doubt. And now let's talk about the Byzantine Empire. By the time we hit the 12th century, the once great empire was on the decline. Its army had started to reflect that, relying mostly on mercenaries. Still, during the First Crusade, the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos could pull together an army of around 70,000 troops when needed. Early on, the Byzantines played a part in helping the Crusader forces before they themselves became victims of the Fourth Crusade in the early 1200s. Their army was a mix of all sorts: Turkish light cavalry, the elite Varangian guards, those guys with Viking and Anglo-Saxon roots wielding massive battle axes, and troops from Serbia, Hungary, and the Rus. Their organization and training were top-notch, but what really made them stand out was their expertise in siege warfare, thanks to their skilled engineers. Now, on the Muslim side, we had the Seljuk Turks. Their recruitment system wasn't all that different from the Europeans, with a mix of elite guards, feudal levies, allied troops, volunteers, and mercenaries. Their cavalry, including mounted archers, was a major asset. These guys would ride in fast, fire off arrows in rapid volleys, and then retreat just as quickly to avoid counterattacks. The Seljuks mastered this hit-and-run style, sometimes baiting their enemies into launching reckless charges, only to ambush them again from a distance. Over in Egypt, the Fatimid Caliphate was another major player. They had vast wealth, which meant they could field large armies made up of mercenaries. Their infantry was well trained and equipped, and their ranks included Sudanese archers, who were known for their skill. The cavalry had a mix of Arab, Bedouin, and Berber soldiers, all wielding scimitars. While the Fatimids had impressive numbers, they were a bit behind in terms of weaponry and tactics when compared to the Crusaders. Their successors, the Ayyubids, led by none other than the legendary Saladin, would quickly close that gap. Speaking of Saladin, under his rule, the Ayyubids became a force to be reckoned with. He reorganized the Fatimid military and ramped up efficiency. Saladin's elite corps was made up of around 1,000 Kurdish warriors, known as the Mamluks, who were trained for battle from a young age. There was also a strong contingent of Kipchak Turkish slave soldiers taken from the Russian steppe. The rest of the army was drawn from regions under Ayyubid control, like Egypt and Syria. Saladin's infantry was particularly disciplined, something that wasn't always expected of foot soldiers back then. Now, we can't talk about the Ayyubids without giving the Mamluks their due. These guys were so good at what they did that they eventually overthrew their own rulers and set up the Mamluk Sultanate in the mid-13th century. They hired mercenaries from all over, Bedouins, Turks, Armenians, and Kurds, and their massive armies made the Crusaders think twice about open field battles. Mamluk cavalry had some pretty unique features. They wore chain mail across their faces, carried large kite-shaped shields, and their helmets were engraved with verses from the Quran. And get this, they even had musicians on the battlefield. Trumpets and drums weren't just for show, they played loud enough to spook the enemy, and even more importantly, their horses. Moving westward, we had the Moors in Iberia, who played a major role in the Reconquista. Their go-to strategy was hit and run, using lightly armed cavalry armed with lances and javelins. Even their infantry troops got in on the action with throwing javelins and long spears. Berbers, one of the key groups in the Moorish armies, used these distinct heart-shaped shields called adarga, while the Moorish cavalry preferred kite-shaped shields, similar to what we saw in European armies. Finally, by the end of the 14th century, the Crusaders faced a new challenge, the Ottoman Turks. The Ottomans brought something new to the battlefield, with elite units like the Janissaries, who were originally Christian boys conscripted and trained from childhood to become skilled archers. Another elite unit, the Sipahs, was a cavalry force promised estates and tax revenues for their battlefield successes. On top of that, the Ottomans had gunpowder weapons by the 15th century. They used massive cannons. Some of them were 9 meters long and could fire enormous cannonballs weighing 500 kilos over a mile away. Talk about firepower. And that's where we'll pause for now. As you can see, the Crusades weren't just a clash of two sides. They were filled with all sorts of unique armies, strategies, and tactics. And now let's dive into how these Crusader armies were actually organized and how they fought on the battlefield. Crusader armies were usually split into multiple divisions, each led by a senior commander. These commanders had to stick to a pre-agreed battle plan, following the orders of the main field leader. Of course, communication wasn't easy in the heat of battle, with all the dust, noise, and chaos around. Banners were often used as rallying points, and verbal orders were shouted out, but let's be real, things didn't always go according to plan. Some commanders couldn't resist taking unnecessary risks, leading to one part of the army charging ahead without support. And honestly, many defeats during the Crusades came down to this exact issue, one overconfident group making a rash move and getting caught out. When it comes to tactics, the infantry was usually armed with spears or crossbows, protected by basic padded armor. They'd form a protective shield around their heavy cavalry, those famous knights everyone talks about. The idea was to use the infantry as a sort of barrier, keeping enemy arrows from hitting the horses. The same setup would be used when the army was on the move, so they could protect the knights while marching. Now, the knights were the elite of these armies. They were heavily armored, both themselves and their horses, and in battle, they'd charge in tight formations, breaking through enemy lines with their lances. Once they'd broken through, they'd go to work with their long swords, cutting down opponents. But while these knights were powerful, they only made up around 10% of the army, and they needed the right conditions, flat, dry ground, to be effective. If the terrain wasn't right or the enemy was smart enough to avoid a direct charge, the knights weren't as game-changing as you might think. In fact, well-disciplined infantry armed with crossbows could hold their ground against them in certain situations. Speaking of the enemy, Muslim armies quickly adapted to the Crusaders' tactics, even developing their own versions of heavy cavalry. The Ubayds, for instance, started using heavy cavalry units as well. Plus, they had their light cavalry and mounted archers, who would harass the Crusaders from a distance, preventing the knights from organizing those famous charges. So while the image of the knight as the ultimate battlefield force is legendary, the reality was that battles often hinged on a lot more than just a cavalry charge. Now, the Crusades weren't just about field battles. Most of the time, both sides were engaged in siege warfare. When it came time to lay siege to a city, even knights had to get their hands dirty, joining everyone else in trying to break through the walls. They used catapults to launch massive stones, flaming projectiles, and sometimes even psychological warfare, flinging decapitated heads over the walls to demoralize the defenders. And if they were really ruthless, they'd lob diseased corpses into the city to spread sickness. Both Christian and Muslim armies had their own tricks, including building siege towers, using battering rams, or digging tunnels to undermine walls. Meanwhile, the defenders would throw down rocks, boiling liquids, and even send out cavalry charges to disrupt the attacker's camp. It was a brutal game of endurance and strategy. But even the best strategies were nothing without solid logistics, and this is where the Crusaders often struggled. Medieval Europe had lost the logistical know-how of the Romans, and it showed. Crusader armies found themselves in harsh, dry climates with limited resources, and more often than not, they couldn't live off the land. Many Crusader armies fell apart due to a lack of food and water. Starvation and scurvy were constant threats, and disease ran rampant in the filthy camps, especially during long sieges where there was little access to clean water or proper sanitation. Forward planning was hit or miss with the Crusaders. For example, they often went into sieges without proper equipment or navigated rivers without reliable boats. But there were exceptions, like Richard I of England, who was meticulous about logistics. He even shipped over the massive boulders needed for his catapults. On the other hand, the armies of the Crusader states were usually better at planning supply routes, sometimes setting up supply bases in columns to keep things running smoothly. Still, when European leaders got involved, they often ignored the challenges posed by the Middle Eastern terrain. In contrast, Muslim armies were much better at handling logistics. They maintained excellent supply lines, using thousands of camels and mules to transport everything from food to medical supplies. They even had doctors and medical equipment on the move with them. And they didn't stop there. The Muslims frequently made things worse for the Crusaders by spoiling wells, rounding up livestock, and destroying crops. Add to that their efficient communication system, which used pigeon posts spread across the region to relay messages quickly, sometimes over distances of 1,500 kilometers. This allowed them to respond to Crusader movements much more effectively. All in all, while the Crusaders brought a lot of strength and discipline to the battlefield, The combination of smarter tactics, better logistics, and efficient communication on the Muslim side often tipped the scales in their favor.